All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moskowitz here. Welcome to the program. And we are discussing a very basic issue today, something that I've been discussing off and on for the past 4 years, and that is the 2020 election, whether or not it was stolen, whether or not there was ballot fraud to the degree that it was stolen. To help us discuss this, we're joined by author Ken Block. Ken has written a book called Disproven: My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump Campaign, the data that shows why he lost, and how we can improve our elections. Ken, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So, Ken, tell me, how did it come about that your background as a data analyst, and how it was that you were hired by the Trump administration after the election to do an examination of the election?
Sure. I'm a database expert. That's what I've spent my career working on. Projects that my company has delivered include the food stamp debit card system for the state of Texas. It's called the Lone Star Card. We've done
Mhm.
similar systems in other big states. I'm a two-time candidate for governor here in Rhode Island. And after my second campaign in 2014, I became very interested as a technologist in voting data. And I began to really look at it, starting in Rhode Island, but I branched out to every state in which we could take a look. I have a national reputation of not only being good at working with this data, but I have helped defend states from lawsuits that involve voting data, and I've also helped uh, groups sue states on the basis of data voting.
Mhm.
So I have that reputation. I don't know exactly how the campaign found its way to me. I didn't advertise my services to them. I wasn't asking any connections about doing the work. I didn't even know they were planning on doing this. But the day after the election, one of the top campaign attorneys, and when I say campaign attorneys in this case, I'm not talking about Rudy Giuliani, et cetera. There were paid professional attorneys inside the campaign apparatus. They were careful. They hired me to, at first, look for evidence of voter fraud, dead voters, duplicate voters in the swing states, to try to find enough fraud that would both stand up in court and be sufficient to cover the margin of victory in
Mhm.
those swing states. And then quickly, as we were doing that work, the campaign started running past us claims of voter fraud that other people brought to the campaign's attention in the hopes that those claims would become the foundation of successful lawsuits. And what my company was asked to do was evaluate those claims to make sure that they would survive legal scrutiny. And in every circumstance, the answer was no, they did not.
Okay, so you were initially brought in to examine the voter rolls of particularly of the swing states. There are reports of this existing in most states, and that is people who have either passed away or have moved out of state or are not really eligible to be registered voters. They may be students living in another state, and they have two registrations and whatnot. Now, my understanding is that one of the primary organizations that work is by the acronym ERIC,
Mhm.
and that ERIC is basically, has done nothing. I mean, they've done very little to actually help the states purge their voter rolls of non-voting registrations, and that they are very partisan in nature. Did you encounter them at all, and what has been their role in that?
So, Eric and the member states that make up its constituency uh, does an okay job at finding duplicate registrations provided to them by the different states that participate. They didn't factor at all into the work that I did for the Trump campaign, and I'm sure the Trump campaign didn't ask Eric for any help during the period directly after the election when these lawsuits could be filed.
Why
Uh,
not? I mean, it seems to me that they're the primary group that does this work, and it's over 20 states, including Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania.
So the problem is, Eric, to look at the election results, you have to grab the voter data as of election night when the polls
Right.
close. Uh, it's a big, challenging job because most states don't have data that's ready to be distributed to the public, let alone for any other purpose. And I'm confident that the member states of Eric were very busy conducting the election and didn't really have time to get into that kind of a data request
Right.
to help the Trump campaign. And honestly, the work that we did in looking at 31 million mail ballots cast across all the swing states, we did a far more thorough job of evaluating duplicate voters than Eric could have ever done. Because Eric depends on driver's license and social security numbers provided by the member states to do their matching to determine if two people with the same name and date of birth are the same or not. We don't do it that way. We figure out the social security numbers separately from those that the state has on file. And our data is more accurate, honestly. So we did a more comprehensive look than Eric could have ever done in the 30 days after the election.
Well, I mean, there's been reports of dead voters, for lack of a better word, that certainly go back long before this election. I mean, it goes back to actually there was research done on the Kennedy Nixon election by a pretty large group of objective journalists. More recently, I think they concluded their report, I think in 2014, and they concluded that that election had been stolen in Chicago because of dead voters. So this isn't something that's new. I mean, it's something that may be somewhat baked into the system, and it's a genuinely legitimate concern. Now,
Sure.
you
So just to try to allay your fears just a little bit, we took all 31 million votes cast by mail in the swing states. We pushed them through our data vendor, who married up those voters based on their name, age, and address to their social security numbers.
mhm,
And then we used the social security numbers to look them up in the social security death master file. That's a database of every single person who's died. It's the most current, best place to figure out who's alive and who's dead. And we found no more than a handful of votes in each swing state cast by someone who was deceased. And in Pennsylvania's circumstance, I highlighted, we had done a similar look at the Pennsylvania data for a lawsuit a month to 2 months before the election. And I found a couple of deceased voters who had just registered.
right,
And I predicted, and it's part of the court case, I predicted that those deceased registrants would end up yielding fraudulent votes in Pennsylvania, and they did. Uh, the fraudulent votes weren't stopped in the 2020 election, but after the election, the people who committed those fraudulent votes were prosecuted, and they pled guilty, both of them,
right.
to the federal crime of election fraud. So I don't think anybody has ever done a more comprehensive look at deceased voters in an election the way that I did for the Trump campaign in
Hmm.
2020. And there were minuscule numbers of actual votes cast by those who are no longer with us.
What about the absentees?
That
I
we
mean,
that those are the mail ballots. We looked at every
well,
mail
you
ballot that was
said
cast.
that there was how many million absentee ballots cast in the so-called battleground states? Did you say 31 million?
31 million.
That's incredible. I mean, first of all, the Carter Baker Blue Ribbon Commission, as part of the Carter Library, did research on absentee ballots, and they concluded a report after a 3-year study, a bipartisan report, which advised against absentee ballots, basically stating that unless someone has a pretty darn good reason for casting one, that they can show that they're incapacitated or they're overseas, there shouldn't be absentee ballots. And the fact is that in the 2020 election, there was the largest outmailing of absentee ballots in American history to people who weren't even asking for that. I mean, I got several in the mail. here in Massachusetts.
No, you didn't get you didn't get several absentee ballots. You got several mail ballot applications. That's
Okay.
a very different. This is a frequent confusion when we're talking about absentee ballots and what is an actual live ballot. Anybody who received more than one mailing about absentee ballots, you were receiving applications to apply for an absentee ballot. You weren't receiving actual, real, live mail ballots. So
Understood.
that's been
Okay.
a large confusion everywhere whenever I talk about this.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for clearing up that misconception. The Carter Baker report concluded that the absentee ballot system was rife with corruption, and they advised against it. And because of the excuse of COVID, the states, according to Molly Ball, who is a New York Times reporter and who wrote an article that was published in Time magazine, I urge people to read it, in February of 2022, um, they engaged in an unprecedented mailing of absentee ballots. I don't think that there's a system in place, at least as far as I know, that would confirm that the absentee ballot is cast by the person who is on the name on that ballot. And that some of the battleground states, particularly Michigan, and quite illegally, as it turned out, according to a state judge, the secretaries of state lowered the standards in terms of proving the validity of the absentee ballots. In the case of Michigan, Attorney General Jocelyn Benson got rid of the signature requirement. Now, Massachusetts actually is more conservative on this. You really have to show, this state, when it comes to that, is pretty conservative, but other states, they kind of put aside those sorts of state legislature approved conditions under the guise that there was an emergency because of COVID. And so you had absentee ballots coming in that had a questionable identity and, point of purchase. I forget the word they used for that, but, proof of identity when they arrived. Now, the other question I have about the absentee ballots is they're arriving at state clerks' offices, right? Who actually does the counting of those? And how is that done in a way that the public got some assurance that they were being accurately counted?
Uh, you ask an extraordinarily difficult question because the answer is it depends on the election jurisdiction.
Uh-huh.
Uh, there are 50 states, but there is way more than 50 election jurisdictions. Almost every large state, actually every large state, takes the operations of elections and pushes it down to the county level. Different counties can have different rules and regulations governing how they conduct the election, just as different states have different rules governing how they can conduct the election. I have a couple of, I understand what your basic concern is, and I share it. And it's how do you ensure that the person who casts the mail ballot vote is the person who should cast the mail ballot vote?
Exactly.
And signature checking is a terrible way to try to prove that. It really doesn't work well because I
Okay.
can't sign anything I sign the same way twice, no matter what.
I don't agree with you on that, but how do they do it then? What is the
Well,
methodology?
I believe that we should have a voter identification number that is implemented in a way that only the voter can know what that is, and that number should be supplied whenever they cast a mail ballot. A very strong form of identification would solve all of those concerns. Now, do I think it's likely, given the scenario that you point is a good one, in that we are weak, security weak in terms of identification of who's casting the vote, but to take advantage of that weakness in numbers big enough to have impacted an election is a real trick, because you have to apply for the mail ballots in most states. If you're not applying for the mail ballot, you have to intercept the mail ballot that's been mailed out, not just once or twice, but in the case of Georgia, it would have had to have been 12,000 times. In Pennsylvania, it would have had to have been 90,000 times. You'd have to fill in the mail ballot applications if you were going to have to apply for the mail ballot. Then you'd have to receive these mail ballots at different locations, because if you had all those mail ballots being shipped to one address, somebody was going to notice that and take a problem with it. And then you have to, in states where they were signature checking, you still have to have a passably close signature to make the whole thing work. In short, it's incredibly difficult to pull off. It's fairly simple to pull off voter fraud in small numbers. It's actually very difficult to do it successfully in large enough numbers to matter and get away with it, and nobody identifies that you did it.
Well, I think that the issue isn't, quote, voter fraud. The issue is ballot fraud, and it's the question of whether or not partisan figures put in place, like Attorney, I'm not to pick on her, but Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who was financed in her campaign by George, might have engaged in, well, they are so opposed to voter ID. You mentioned that there should be some sort of a voter ID with absentee ballots. Their rule of thumb has been to oppose all forms of voter ID, which was, by the way, an about face, because originally they were for that. But for the particular election of 2020, there was massive opposition to it, and there was this turf group funded by George Soros called Center for Constitutional Rights, which floated a campaign that somehow it was racist to support voter ID, as if black people can't have ID. Everyone has ID. I mean, you need an ID to go to buy a six-pack of beer. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's also quite insulting. But the point is that there was a massive campaign to prevent that, and all sorts of activity politically to stop any of those attempts to have basic voter ID in advance of the 2020 election, which I find very suspicious. I also think it's awfully strange that the same Democrats now in Congress are opposing a bill, a very basic bill, but put forth by the Republican House to make sure that illegal aliens don't register to vote. Some journalists have already discovered that many of them are registered. And here in Massachusetts, for example, they have given driver's licenses to almost 100,000 illegal aliens, or have made it possible. And when you have a driver's license, you automatically can register to vote in this state. So there seems to be an obvious agenda
Wait a minute,
there.
are you saying that the automatic registrations for somebody who gets a driver's license but is not a citizen is automatically granted?
Not automatically.
I doubt that.
No, it's not automatically granted, but when you apply for the license, you can get it. I can speak to this. I recently renewed my license, and they asked me if I wanted to register to vote. They didn't ask me if I was a citizen.
Right, but when an illegal immigrant applies for a driver's license, they have to identify themselves as not a legal citizen. And
I'm not sure about that.
I would be very surprised, because there are a lot of the driver's licenses have information, has a lot of ties to federal programs and a lot of other things.
Right, the National ID program, but that's a separate issue. You don't have to have that. And I don't know if there's a direct connection between getting the license.
I don't know either, but I would be shocked if
I wouldn't be.
I would be shocked. Look, I live in Rhode Island, which is arguably even more liberal than Massachusetts, and
Right.
I know for
may not be as corrupt though.
Oh, we've sent more speakers to jail than you have. Of that, I can
Yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about political, not personal corruption.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the Jocelyn Benson kind of corruption.
Yeah, but I do think that with DMVs, because of there's many different federal programs that tie into it, they have to be cognizant of the citizenship status of people, and I believe firmly that they have legal requirements to not offer voter registrations to non-citizens. So
well, I mean, I don't know if they have requirements. I think that it's open for potential fraud.
It's confusing. It's confusing for sure.
Now, I'm sure that you probably, like me, watched the election returns on election eve in 2020. And you probably saw, like I did, how 6 states at the almost the exact same second stopped counting their votes. It was about a little bit before 11 o'clock. It was shortly before that that Arnon Mishkin from Fox News announced that Arizona had gone for Biden, even though there was absolutely no information to indicate that. The next day, he apologized with some weak, silly, explanation. But the interesting thing, and Fox News is one of the worst, by the way, in this. I'm not sure why. Was it Murdoch's two sons? Who knows? The point is that it was unprecedented for these 6 states to stop counting. It has never been explained what happened. And in all of those states, Trump was ahead. And in one case, Pennsylvania, he was ahead by 750,000 votes. I remember watching at that time, I'm flipping between Rachel Maddow and Fox and the other stations. And Rachel Maddow actually was more honest than anyone. When Georgia shut down, she's there scratching her head. She's like, is there something hinky going on here? But then, of course, I don't know, maybe somebody got the message to her to straighten out, because then she put on a more straight face after that. But the point is that there was something hinky going on. What was that about? How could it be that 6 states shut down and stopped counting, and then the next morning they resume counting and we find out that Trump is losing?
So I don't have any personal research went on as far as the shutdowns, restarts. I don't believe anyone's ever shown that there was any kind of collusion between the states to do that. I think those were 6 separate decisions that were made, and I think
At the same moment?
I don't know if they were exactly at the same moment.
I watched it happen. Everyone did. That's why 60% of people, Republicans, and probably who knows how many Democrats and independents, believed that the election had been stolen. There was something very, very fishy about the whole thing. I don't know. I personally would suggest that there may have been an algorithm or something computer-wise that led to this, in the same way that if you buy stock on the New York Stock Exchange, you can put a stop loss message on the purchase, which says that if your stock dips below a certain amount, automatically it's sold.
Did these 6 states all use the exact same vendor and machines for their counting?
No, not necessarily, but I'm just saying that
your theory is extremely unlikely, because that would mean cross-vendor collusion.
Not necessarily. They could all have 6 different algorithms and 6 different stop loss messages.
I don't think so. Let me ask you this question. You talked about how Trump was leading after the same day in-person votes were cast. And by extension, I'm going to assume that therefore you're going to express shock that so many Biden votes were contained in the mail ballots, correct?
Well, I think that he was leading in all parts of the vote, both mail-in and in-person.
I don't think so, not the mail ballots.
Well, because this all happened at about 11 o'clock at night, so
right. But what you're missing, and what everybody misses who starts talking about this. And by the way, this isn't where my focus was at all. I was strictly inside the data. This is sort of, forgive me, but it's kind of crazy conspiracy stuff that you're floating here. But the reality is that President Trump, he spent months demonizing mail ballots to Republican voters, and Republican voters stayed away from mail ballots in droves as a result of that. So when the vast percentage of mail ballots were counted, and they were mostly Biden votes, and it closed the gap as time went on, that's largely a function of the fact that we usually have a much better, closer distribution of votes cast by Republicans and Democrats for mail ballots. It's only in 2020 where it really became a partisan voting tool. And that was a specific strategy that Trump followed. And it makes sense when you understand that, and no one could argue that he didn't do this. He did it for months before the election. So when all the mail ballots that came in were mostly Democrat, nobody should be surprised. And nobody should be surprised that the percentages of the vote changed while all of those mail ballots were counted. So, the problem that I have with everything that you're talking about here is you have some disconnected data points, but you're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that in 2020, many more Democrats cast mail ballots than Republicans, largely because of Trump's own actions. And
Mhm.
therefore, how can we be shocked with what the ultimate results were? That as they counted the mail ballots, Trump's lead narrowed and ultimately disappeared, because we also saw so many more mail ballots cast in 2020 because of COVID
Okay.
than we
No,
had in
look,
any year
I
previously.
think that I will concede that Trump and the Republicans tried to emphasize getting out on voting day and not mailing in your ballot. And we saw what happened, for example, in 2022 in Arizona, in Maricopa County, when they all showed up to vote and they found out that the machines were shut down, especially in Republican precincts. The paper didn't fit the machine. It jammed the machine, namely because this company that printed the papers, which, by the way, was a partisan Democrat printing house, had made it so that the font size and the border size would automatically jam the machines. And so that way, all these ballots were then thrown into a box somewhere where they became provisional ballots. And that raises questions about when were they counted and how were they counted. And it resulted, I think, in the loss for Kerry Lake. But there was definitely the emphasis on
So
voting.
hold on. Uh, when you analyze the actual votes cast uh, in Kerry Lake's races, both of them, uh, I'm sorry, in her 2022 race,
Yes.
what you find is that while there are many ballots where all the down ticket Republicans received votes, but Carrie Lake and the other three top of the ticket Republicans who shared her views on election denialism received no votes. Either the vote went to the Democrat or it was left blank, and way more votes were cast with that look to them, where down ticket Republicans received the vote and top of the ticket, except for the treasurer, all didn't get the Republican votes. That's way more than her margin of loss was. So there
Okay. Well,
are,
it doesn't
I mean,
explain why those.
and that's hard data, right? And
Yeah.
that's right there to be seen. And even in the face of that and being confronted with it, she still would prefer to say that the election was stolen from her, as opposed to what is in effect a really simple, brutal statement. And that statement is election denialism works for a percentage of the electorate, but it doesn't work for all of them. And
Well,
when
it
it
doesn't
for the
explain
voters
why
that
those
wait a minute, and
precincts
for
were
the
shut
voters that
down.
it doesn't work for, they sometimes penalize those candidates, and that happened in a big way in Arizona.
I don't believe that.
The Republican treasurer, who's now the treasurer, and she was the candidate in 22, received more votes statewide than any other statewide candidate on the ticket. Don't tell me that there was some kind of weird fraud where the governor, lieutenant governor, the attorney general all got screwed by some sort of fraud mechanism, but the treasurer didn't, who was shared the Republican ticket with them. I don't buy that for a minute.
Well, it doesn't explain why it is that those specific precincts where the majority of Republican voters were casting their votes were shut down and people were told to go home. They couldn't vote that day. It also
Well, they
gets
did, but they did vote. They voted provisionally, correct?
right, which is a very questionable practice. In other words, they had to put it in some box to be counted later. I would like to see how that happened and how whether or not those votes were properly counted in a counting room where you had both a Democrat and a Republican observing the actual counting. That to me, it looked awfully odd the way that happened. And it's not just Maricopa County, but there was some other counties where there was some rather strange activities. I think there's some major corruption going on in that state. And in 2020, according to Rudolph Giuliani, in Phoenix and in Pittsburgh, you had many thousands of people turned away who showed up to vote because
So
they were told, "Oh, you already voted. We have it already down here. Sorry, you can't vote." So they ended up having to cast provisional ballots when they hadn't voted, which raises the
so here's
question number one of what happened to the provisional ballot, but number two, if they had already voted, how did that happen and who voted for them and how did they vote?
So getting back to the Arizona outcome real quick in
Sure.
2022, for the precincts where as you yourself described, Republican precincts where the machines were shut down,
Yes.
if the shutdown of those machines was the fraud that caused Kerry Lakes and I don't know the names of the
Abe
uh,
Hamadeh,
yeah, and so,
who
but
lost by less than
Secretary of
100
State,
votes.
Lieutenant
Yeah.
Governor, and Attorney General, how can that outage cause them to lose, yet allow Kimberly Yee, the treasurer's candidate, to gallop to a win? She
Probably
was
because
also
she
a
got
Republican.
and maybe because she got the Democrats voting for her. I don't know. We can't know the registry. And when you go into when you vote in a general election, you don't, you're not asked whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And you have people in Arizona, they have, I don't know, in the primary, I think in the primary you can switch parties. In fact, people are doing that right now, and I urge them to do it. Democrats in Minnesota to vote against Elon Omar because in Minnesota you can, as a Republican, register as a Democrat for a day to vote for the Democrat that's running against her. There's sort of a grassroots movement to do that right now. So there's a lot of possibilities in
But
terms
my
of
explanation of the actual ballot examination that showed that there were many Republican ballots, and by Republican ballots I mean all down ticket Republicans receiving votes, but the top of the ticket, the election deniers, were left blank. That's not proof enough to you that there was a broad appeal problem for those candidates as opposed
no.
to
And
Kimberly Yee?
also, I mean, I think most 60% of Republicans and probably a large percent of Democrats and independents do believe the election was stolen.
Well,
As
sure,
far as
but
the
it,
demonization of so-called election deniers, we went through 4 years of this cockamamie conspiracy theory that Putin had colluded with or conspired with Trump to steal the 2016 election. So there's plenty of people who engage in that. And I don't think that there was any evidence of that because after spending $35 million, you had Mueller and his brown shirts issue a report in which on page 1 they said, no, that hadn't
yeah.
happened. We still are
Can
going to
we
try
keep
to.
this focused on the 2020 election? And I'm
Yeah,
happy to talk
I
about.
just want to
I
comment on
can't
so-called
get
election
into
denial.
this deep
I
historical.
understand. I just
And
want
look,
to.
the other thing I want to say, you're throwing a lot of stuff out there. I need to be able to
Yeah.
communicate a little
Oh,
bit
yeah.
back
And
to
we
you.
have plenty of time
So
here. I
yeah,
just wanted
and
to
so
clarify on the issue of election denial and talk
yeah,
about who was denying elections. That's all.
but
Anyway,
one of the
to
challenges
move
is
on to my next question, the issue of Dominion voting machines.
I can't address that. I never got to look directly at it.
Okay.
Uh, so that is all hearsay charges. There's not a shred of proof that the Dominion machines had anything that was wrong with them. If there was some documentation, Fox News would have had it. They would have fought back and they would not have had to pay $750 million in defamation. Uh, I have to talk about real stuff. I cannot talk about fantasy stuff. And the Dominion machine claims, and this is what I was trying to say just a minute ago, the reason people are so spun up and they believe that only fraud could explain all of these things is the only thing they're hearing is that there was fraud, 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 fraud. And when the very
We're seeing.
reasonable, wait, hold on. And when very reasonable, hard, factual information is brought to bear to explain the phenomenon as opposed to fraud having caused Kerry Lake's loss, for example, you kind of brush it over and go, well, nah, I just want to
No, we
believe the
saw
fraud
we
stuff
saw what
instead.
happened with the shutdown of those precincts, and we saw what happened on election night with the shutdown in 6 states. Now, Rudy Giuliani has said now that there are 3 whistleblowers on the Dominion issue, and I would just note I don't know what happened there, and I'm not making any claims, but one of the major contentions on election day was that the voting machines were not online, so they couldn't be possibly manipulated. And
How can you credibly and comfortably talk about unproven hearsay allegations? You said you
I'm
don't
about
know.
to make
You
my
don't
point
have
about
direct
the
know.
online.
And Rudy Giuliani owes hundreds of millions of dollars because he lied about Ruby
No, I
Freeman's
reject that. I mean,
things in the election.
he's being
So he's
harassed by the
Rudy. Wait,
American Bar Association, as are any lawyers
hold
who
on.
in any way help Trump. Now, as far
Rudy
as
Freeman, sorry, Rudy Giuliani is not a credible source
I
for
think he's a
any
very
kind of
credible
election data.
source. I disagree. I think he's a great man. Now, the issue of yeah, very funny. The
It
issue of
is. He
Dominion
lied. He
no,
lied.
he
He
did not
admitted he
lie.
lied.
I reject that. Now, the issue of Dominion on
His own
one
words,
of
he lied. He admitted to lying.
fine. I mean, he's a great
I mean,
man, and I believe him.
he admitted it, and
Maybe
he didn't
you
confess.
probably. I'd like to see exactly what he admitted to. They probably got some technical thing. Look, the point is that one of the
Wow.
main contentions about Dominion was that it was not online on election eve,
I
right?
can't talk about Dominion.
All right.
It's
I want to.
hearsay
We'll move
allegations.
on. I
It's
just want to make.
nonsense.
I want to
It's
make the
nonsense.
point that anybody who claimed that it was online was attacked viciously as some tin hat, evil, less than human conspiracy theorist. Well, recently we found out that there was this thing with Google when they tried to download some software, and for a couple of days it followed up a lot of the airlines. I know that the hotel services were filed up for a few days. This happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think you remember that, right?
Yeah.
Well, it turned out that they find out that in Maricopa County they had to stop the election because all the voting machines were online, and that they were getting messed up because of this interference by this particular coded software. So, I mean, really? How is it then that they were online? After all that abuse that was heaped on anybody who brought that up in 2020, they were online. That was something that was routinely acknowledged. So I don't know
And they
what
should not have been.
ultimately.
I agree with you
Thank
100%.
you. All right. And
Voting
as long
machines
as they
do
were
not
online,
belong
they could be
online.
subject to manipulation.
Voting machines do not belong online in
They
any
don't,
way.
yeah, I agree. I mean, of course, but the problem is that they were. And it kind of verifies some of the concerns that were expressed by whistleblowers at that time about that possibility. That's all I'm saying about that. It is an issue. And I mean, President Trump has said that if he's reelected, in fact, it's part of the Republican National Committee platform, that we are going to do like most nations in the world do, and that is have, paper ballots that are voted upon at a set time, that absentee ballots are going to be the exception, that unless you can really show that you need one, and that we're going to finally get honest elections. I don't think we've had honest elections in this country going way back. This isn't unique now. I mean, Thomas Jefferson stole the election in 1801. I love Jefferson, but nevertheless, we've never gotten it right in this country. There's
Does that
always
include
been
2016?
issues. Excuse me?
Does that include the 2016 election?
Well, I think the 2016 election, Trump was not supposed to win, but he did. And I think it shocked the system, in which case, according to Molly Ball, New York Times reporter, you had meetings with top officials and the high tech and the big tech companies like Zuckerberg, who wrote a personal check of $420 million for walkaround money to engage in ballot harvesting, and probably nothing that's outright illegal, but questionable, especially in Michigan, where you had people showing up at nursing homes and filling out ballots. That they had meetings with these people, Jack Dorsey, Zuckerberg, and they said, we can't let this ever happen again. That's when they began implementing the algorithm, which knocked people off the air, and which began a massive censorship campaign.
So,
one
Charles,
that culminated after the Electoral College meeting, and Trump was removed from Twitter with his 30 million followers.
Can I talk now?
Please.
Okay. So almost everything that you and I have talked about outside of the physical ballot examination in Arizona in 2022, and lightly touching on the work that I did for the Trump campaign in 2020, everything you're talking about is circumstantial, indirect evidence that cannot possibly ever stand up in a court of law. And what's really important for all of your listeners to understand is that to contest an election, and to get an election overturned. You can't come in with circumstantial hearsay evidence that is not accepted in a court of law, because to overturn an election is a legal exercise. You have to do it via the court system. You have a very defined, very narrow window of time in which to do so successfully. It's usually within 4 to 5 weeks of the election. After that, it's simply too late. And what you have to bring is what the campaign paid me to try to find, which was unimpeachable hard data, which the other side's lawyers and experts couldn't tear down. And everything that we've been talking about since probably at least half of this conversation has been you talking about circumstantial versus hearsay levels of evidence that cannot be used to contest an election result in our legal system. So one of the big frustrations I have when we're talking about whether or not our elections are on the up and up or whether they're broken is just the kind of conversation that we're having right now, because you're talking about things that nobody can prove or disprove. It falls right into the same kind of conversation like a tractor trailer loaded with ballots that somebody saw in New York highways that ended up in Pennsylvania. Well, no one ever has a
Right.
picture of this thing.
No, there was testimony from the driver of that truck who did look at those
But
ballots,
that's hearsay.
and
It's
he
not
found out that
evidence.
they were all made. No, that's actually, he's been exonerated. They found out that they were all already pre-made out to Biden. No, that was one of those
Oh,
situations.
really?
Where, yeah, really.
Is that so? That was
He
something
did,
that
you know,
he
you
was
have to check
exonerated
out.
where in some legal system?
Recently, the post office has exonerated him, and he just was a driver. He didn't have any particular political agenda.
When you say exonerated him,
Yeah,
then
he
you
was right.
said that it was loaded with
It was
where were
loaded
ballots?
with ballots that had been pre-made out. There was another case like that in Wisconsin, where you had ballots that had already been. In fact, this other
Where's your
corrupt,
proof of that? Can you show me the
his
proof of that?
testimony, his
His testimony is hearsay and not allowable in court. Where
I
are
don't,
the
why
filled out
why do you
ballots?
say it's not allowable in court? I mean, I think it is allowable in court.
No, it actually isn't. The you cannot you can't have things determined by he said, she said. And what you
You
just
have
laid
to
out to
have,
me is he
look,
said.
you know what, you're quite right, Ken, in that there has to be either an adjudication in a courtroom, which didn't happen because none of these cases were allowed, or you have to have enough people in Congress to conduct hearings and get testimony and then file a report based upon those hearings, which
Congress is
didn't
not a
happen
legal
either.
system. Congress is not a legal system. Congress is populated by partisans on both sides. The
No, but
the
congressional
proper
hearings,
the only place to contest an election result is in the court system
right.
and within the election infrastructure of each state. That is where it happens. It cannot and should not happen in Congress. That is absolutely the wrong place to do it, because depending on the makeup of the House of Representatives at the time, it's going to lean Republican or it's going to lean Democrat, and you're going to get a result that's partisan as a result
Well,
of it.
based on what you're saying, there should be no congressional hearings at all. I mean, Congress, that's their job, to hold hearings, to try to have a balanced hearing where you have each party appoint their members to the committee, which of course didn't happen for the so-called January 6th committee. But putting that aside, you then have lawyers on both sides basically conducting the theory that each side presents. And then you have hearings where each side gets to ask the person being testifying questions. And yeah, sure, it's partisan, but that's how Congress does it. As far as the judicial system goes, none of those cases got inside a courtroom, so we never heard testimony. We'll never get to the bottom of it because they were all dismissed on
Right.
jurisdictional grounds, which is something that
Not
is
all. Wait, not all. That's
which one
a
wasn't?
false statement.
Then
That
which
is an
one wasn't?
absolutely false statement.
Which one
Some
wasn't?
some were jurisdictional. They were misfiled. They were put in the wrong place. Others had no data, no foundational data behind them at all. They were thrown out for either lack of foundation, or they were thrown out because the Trump campaign or subordinates who filed on behalf of the Trump campaign filed lawsuits that could not document the harm that was being claimed, right? So you need two things to overturn an election. You need documented fraud, and then you have to be able to prove that the fraud caused the election to have the wrong outcome. The Kraken lawsuits by Sidney Powell were tossed out almost on their face because they were wholly composed of hearsay evidence. That was it. There was not a shred of fact.
First of all, you don't have to have proof.
Let me finish what I'm saying.
Please.
There was not a shred of hard evidence in her 200 plus pages of complaint when her cases were thrown out of court with some of the harshest language I've ever seen judges use, including a Republican judge. It was a crap it was a crap lawsuit filing, and it got smashed legally as it should have. So there were a number of problems like that. I helped stop a couple of lawsuits from being filed at all because the foundational data on which they were put together were misdone. They were completely wrong. So even though there were facts,
well, they were untested.
Those facts were arrived at in a completely invalid way, and they were incorrect facts.
No, so, they were not tested in a courtroom where you have both sides arguing and presenting their point of view, and then you have a jury deciding that.
But you only
never made it that far because of mostly jurisdictional issues.
Charles,
you're right. Maybe not all, but it was mostly that it was decided by the clerks and the judges because mainly the state court did not want to hear these cases, and they were on record in some cases as saying that they didn't want to hear it because they did not want to affect the outcome of an election. They did not want this to happen because it could have affected that, and they felt
that's not illegal. That is, I don't believe you can point me to any legal document in the filing of a court case that has that as the reasoning.
No, you can't. That was an opinion expressed. I forget the judge's name, but he was in Wisconsin. Said, "I'm not going to let this go forward because I don't want to affect the outcome of the election in my state."
Yeah. So
that was generally the stance of the judiciary, and it was wrong.
The truth about the 60 plus court cases that were filed is the vast majority of them were garbage. They did not survive. They did. Are you a legal expert?
Are you?
I have worked with lawyers on countless cases.
I do have some legal connections. I'm not going to get into what.
And I understand the foundations upon which a successful lawsuit can proceed, and in which a lawsuit will get bounced out because it lacks the proper foundations in fact. And
there's a law in terms of what a court wants to hear, and if they don't want to hear something, they can find a way to have it not get into the courtroom. And I think
that's not what happened in the vast majority.
I believe it is.
Well, okay.
Not all, but in the vast majority.
I'm not sure we can have a real productive conversation.
No, we'll just leave it at that and let my listeners decide. That's my contention. That's the contention of a lot of people on the Republican side. And,
but you understand it's based on a garbage, unrealistic interpretation of what actually happened with each. I could sit here for the next 3 hours and go through every one of the documents filed in those court cases and show you the defects that caused a lot of those filings to be bounced out.
Yeah, I'm sure they found some technicality. They did not want to get into politics.
Oh my God, they're not technicalities.
The courts did not want to change the outcome of an election. Now, let's get off the merry-go-round here. I think we both made our points. I've gone into this before. There was not. I mean, first of all, you had the situation in Fulton County, Georgia, where the lady with the blonde braids and her brother and two other people shut down the arena because they claimed that there had been a water main break.
Hey, Charles, I'm going to stop you again. You're talking about hearsay, anecdotal stuff.
This isn't hearsay.
Charles, I'm not here to talk about that.
Okay.
I'm not here to talk
I'm not either. These are facts. I've seen the video of her stuffing the ballot over and over again. because one of the
Can we talk
cameras
about some real
captured
stuff,
that.
or is this where we're going to go at this point?
We can talk about the video that I saw,
Okay.
which she's stuffing the ballot over and over again, and she
I
took a
think I'm
black
going to have
box
to
out of the
leave.
desk.
If we can't have a,
Then
if we can't have
we'll
a
let
more
people
focused,
decide. You can't see that now because it's been censored. Look, it's all going to be, if President Trump survives and is elected, then we'll probably ultimately get to the bottom of it. I actually don't think we should be talking about this issue now with just 3 months before an election, because the important thing is the election itself. And if President Trump is reelected, we'll get to the bottom of it afterwards. So in a way, the whole conversation, I think, should be probably put off for now. I don't like the fact that people who observed what happened on election eve, which is a fact, 6 states shutting down their counting almost at the same moment, are told that everything is just fine and great, and we should all just pay no attention to it. But again, I think most Americans know that there was something that happened there, at least. That we're not even talking about Wayne County in Michigan and preventing, and in Philadelphia, preventing people from observing. Now we have a situation where the head of the Republican Party is going to be fielding 175 volunteer election observers, people who are going to be sitting in the counting room and making sure things are properly counted, just like Governor Youngkin did in Virginia. So there is some hope. And if President Trump survives, maybe we'll have a more clean election. And if he loses, fine. The point is that at least we'll have a situation where some of the things discussed by Molly Ball, New York Times reporter, and I urge people to read her article. It's available online, February of 2022, Time magazine, talked about and laid out in very clear terms how that election happened and how that was pulled off. Anyway, Ken, let my listeners know where they can get your book.
Sure. So I have a quick message for your listeners, and then I'll pitch the book quickly.
Sure.
The conversation that went back and forth here was kind of a remarkable one, and what I just ask everybody to try to keep in mind as you process everything is there is a monumental difference between hearsay, anecdotal evidence, where you cannot touch it, feel it, quantify it, have it stand up in court, and hard evidence that's incontrovertible, that is documented, that's verifiable. You can quantify the number of fraudulent votes, all those things. They're dramatically different things. And the tension between what Charles was talking about and what I'm talking about, they're night and day. And that's why I kind of had to stop the conversation, because I have no ability to talk with any authority, nor does anybody, about a lot of the anecdotal
because it hasn't been adjudicated.
Please let me finish.
Yeah,
Anecdotal hearsay things that Charles talked about. So my book, if you're interested in knowing exactly what we looked at for the Trump campaign, if you want to know how we did it, if you want to understand why close to 20 different claims of voter fraud that other people made to the campaign that we evaluated as false, why they were false, that's all there in the book. The book is called Disproven. It's available everywhere you buy books. You can also get it on the website, which is kenblock.com. Same name as the former race car driver. I only get speeding tickets when I race, but same name spelled the same way, B-L-O-C-K.
Okay, Ken, you did a good job of examining a very specific slice of the election. I'm saying that in the overall discussion, we don't know the truth because it's been, I would suggest it, not adjudicated, not properly examined by the media, which refused to do it. And the only way to get to that truth is either inside a courtroom or inside the halls of Congress. And that's not going to happen until after the election, if Trump wins. If he doesn't win, who knows? Anyway, Ken, but I want to thank you again, and take care. Thank